through the Bible. Today, let us listen to the story of King David giving a place for the cripple at his table. David shows kindness to Mephibosheth. 2 Samuel chapters 8 and 9. When David became king over the united people of Israel, all the small nations round about and their kings were afraid. Instead, however, of making alliance with David, they raided his towns and villages, and he had to make war against them. So for a long time, there was no real peace in the land. The first enemies that had to be dealt with were the Philistines, and they were defeated at Mephibosheth. Then David turned his attention to the Moabites, and before long they had been conquered and had been made the servants of Israel. In the north, the Syrians sent armed bands across the border, so David then turned against them and drew them back into their own land after a terrible battle in which 22,000 Syrians were killed. After this, David placed garrisons of Israelite soldiers in the Syrian towns, especially in Damascus, and the Syrians became servants of Israel and had to send gifts and taxes to Jerusalem. There was one other tribe that caused trouble for Israel, and that was Edom in the south. Into their land, David also sent armed men who established garrisons in the main Edomite towns. The Edomites too had to pay tribute to King David. This victory ended the danger from the nations and the nearby tribes. Now the kings of many others rushed to make alliances with David, and a time of peace began for Israel. When peace came to the land, David had a chance to think quietly of the promise he had made to his friend Jonathan, and that was to always take care of Jonathan's children and all his family. So he sent to find out if there were any of the descendants of Saul to whom he could show kindness for Jonathan's sake. His men discovered that an old servant of Saul's, Ziba, was still living, and they brought him to David. The king asked him if he knew of any of Saul's family to whom he could be kind out of memory for Jonathan. Ziba answered that there was a son of Jonathan who very much needed help. His name was Mephibosheth, and he was a cripple. When the terrible battle had taken place with the Philistines, in which Saul and Jonathan were killed, Mephibosheth was a little boy. As the Philistines came pouring into the land, his nurse had tried to run away with the boy and hide him. But as they fled, Mephibosheth fell and hurt his legs. After that, he was a cripple because his legs never healed properly. Now Mephibosheth had lived for a long time in the home of Machir in the village of Lo-debar, right on the other side of Jordan. When David heard this, he sent for Mephibosheth. The young man was afraid, and when he came to David, he threw himself down before the king. But David said, "Do not be afraid. I will not harm you for the sake of your father, Jonathan, who was my dear friend. I will be kind to you. All the land which belonged to your grandfather Saul I give to you, and you will always have an honored place at the royal table in my palace." Then David called Ziba and told him what he had given to Mephibosheth. Because Mephibosheth was a cripple, Ziba and his family must take care of his land, and Mephibosheth himself would live and be looked after in the king's palace all his days. In this way, King David kept the promise he had made to his good friend Jonathan.